had three businesses that I've sold that I've owned personally. And then obviously as a broker, I've sold many businesses in many industries. But my first business was after I was a CPA at Arthur Andersen. I decided to open a bagel shop because I thought it would help me learn about business and which would help me in grad school. And I wanted to get my MBA. So I quit at Arthur Andersen and learned to make bagels where I used to go to lunch. And then
now, why bagels in particular? Were you a big bagel fan, or?
You know, I did. I liked bagels, and it was kind of a growing industry back then. This is a while ago. At the time, I think it's a strange figure, but only 20% of the U.S. population had ever tried a bagel. I'm really not 90. It wasn't that long ago, but it was a while ago. And I learned to make them in Boston and moved back to Seattle where I grew up, and there weren't as many bagel shops back there, and so I thought it was an opportunity. So that's why bagels. I'm not Jewish, although I got recruited by the Jewish softball team. Like, sorry. So I did it. I ran it for 2 years, and then I went and got my MBA at Dartmouth. And I kind of coached Mom through running it for a few years, and then my sister-in-law ran it for a couple of years, and then she wanted to get out of it because she was going to have her second baby and didn't want to focus on that. And so my mom didn't really want to go back into it. I, at that point, was working for Nestle in Los Angeles doing consumer marketing in their candy division, and decided that that we should sell, because I didn't want to come back and open up more bagel shops. I had sort of gone a different direction at that point. And so we had a woman that had worked for us, and she was interested in buying, and it just made a lot of sense. She'd always wanted to be a baker, and she knew how to bake and that kind of thing. But it was one of the valuable lessons you learn about not to depend too much on a seller carry note, because we got a good chunk of the price down, but then part of it was to be paid over time. And she did manage to run the business into the ground in the first year, which was unfortunate. We tried to help, but she had an ex-boyfriend that had been in the food business. I think every time something went wrong, she could call him. So she wanted things to go, I don't know, we can't figure it out. We didn't get the full payment on that one. And so that's one thing I try and advise sellers about, is you really have to know the risk of payments over time. And an important thing that I look for in deals a lot now, not that I have control over it, it's always ultimately the seller that has control. Find buyers that are a good fit culturally and have the experience, because even if there isn't a seller carry note or an earnout that would get paid over time, it's still better to have the business continue. I mean, ultimately, it's part of the reason I sell businesses, to keep jobs, right? That fuels our economy and gives people their livelihood. So it's an important aspect of our world. And so you don't want you don't want to have the seller get a big chunk of money and then have it fail, and neither do they usually. And so, so sometimes you have to pay attention, and sometimes the buyer with the best qualifications doesn't always pay the most, but it might be better in the long run. And so it's a factor to consider.
What's your experience? I want to drill into this idea of carrying a note and earn out over time. Yeah. Do you have you may have a stat, if not just a guess of what percentage of businesses is that more the deal that's struck versus?
So most deals where I would say the price tag's under 2 million, maybe under 5 million, seller carrying, those businesses usually sell to individuals. So there are different types of buyers: individuals, private equity, or what we call financial. They're really looking for the investment and the return, or as industry buyer. And so strategic, we call it. And so those three buyers often go after different things. Individuals typically don't have the funds to do a large purchase. And so they're usually more in the smaller businesses. So under the 2 million, under 5 million, SBA doesn't actually lend above 5 million. So that's why most of those are kind of more individual. And some of those are very sophisticated individuals who have bought multiple businesses and buying more, but a lot aren't. But so a seller carry note is basically where you're loaning to the buyer. And so, for example, if it was $1 million price, they might put down 800, and then you might carry 200 that they'll pay you over time. And one of the calculations you always want to do is they generally pay you out of the profits of the business. And so it's helpful to do that calculation of what's that monthly net that they're going to have to cover. Because if it's way out of range, like you say, oh, you have to pay 200 grand in 12 months, unless they have other resources, then you're sort of setting them up to fail. And hopefully they won't do it, but you just want to be cautious on both sides to make sure you look at that calculation. An earnout is based on results. So you might get, in the same scenario, say the 200 grand is an earnout instead of a seller carry note. The earnout, you wouldn't get that 200 grand unless the company performed to a certain measure. And so sellers are always bullish on how their business is going to perform going down the road, and buyers are always nervous that they're going to miss something. And so there's always this kind of, and an earnout can bridge that gap. But again, it can be, if I can avoid it, I will. In a deal. Regardless, there's, with seller carry notes or earnouts, I would say on the smaller businesses, I never advise more than 20% for a seller carry note. We try to avoid earnouts at all costs, but sometimes that's the only way. And so earnouts often come into play for fast growing businesses where your numbers don't justify a high price, but you're going to get that value down the road. And so in those cases, sometimes we do earnouts, but earnouts are really an area where there's a lot of miscommunication. Like revenues, even revenues, and revenues is the simplest measure, but a buyer can depend on revenues, but they might think that you're going to monkey with the revenues down the road or something like that, push sales forward. And you might think the buyer's going to monkey with revenue. They might postpone a big purchase right after the deadline for it. So they can monkey with those a little bit, but even if it's based on gross margin, which is kind of a little bit more fair for the buyer and seller, it still can be monkeyed with a lot. And certainly if it's profit, they can push through marketing expenses and all kinds of things that might be valid expenses, but might lower the profit. And so all those measurements can create problems down the road. And the best deals are where you don't get into litigation. Litigation never helps, or disputes, regardless of what they are. And so we do everything to try and kind of warn sellers up front to avoid that scenario. From Nestle, I decided I wanted to do something more creative. So I went to work for Disney, who I'd done a lot of work for before. And then I got recruited away to this internet startup, which was very exciting at the time. The internet was still dial-up days, so the internet was pretty new. So I call it the best and worst job I ever had. It was great because we did all this work. We opened up 9 cities. We grew from 150 to 650 people in 1 year, but we were working all the time. And I wasn't sure the basic business model was going to work. And I don't think it ever did, actually, but detail. And so I decided to leave, and I took 3 months off and then came back and opened yoga studios because I was passionate about yoga and wanted to live a more balanced life and enjoyed the entrepreneurial thing. So the yoga studio. So unfortunately, I picked a bad partner in yoga. He turned out to be a sociopath. He sexually harassed students and injured students, and in his mind it didn't happen. So it was a little challenging, and my resources were at risk. So I had to go through a big breakup and get him out of the business, and which was traumatic. He kind of monkeyed with the schedule for the instructors, which was part of the problem. And so he and his wife worked for me, and when they left, 50% of my volume walked out the door. And there's a lot to that story. I mean, he had people stand outside with signs about criticizing. It was amazing. But in a year, we turned the business around, and it was 40% up over where it had been when they left. And I got approached by some other people to buy it, and they wanted me to come work for them. And so I sold and worked for them for a year, and then left the yoga industry. Decided I'd had enough of it. And then from there, a couple other turns in my career, but eventually I ended up back in San Diego because I was recruited by UCSD to teach under the Rady School of Management. I taught entrepreneurship under the Rady School to undergrads, and which was a lot of fun. But while I was doing that, I was only doing it part-time. And so I decided to I was going to start another business. Things didn't work out. And so a friend was looking at brokering, and he wanted to buy a business and had me go along, and I got exposed to it, sort of met a few brokers and decided to try it. So I started my practice back then. It's been 10 years now. It's amazing. Okay, so while I was brokering, I came across an opportunity for a cafe that my friend wanted to manage, and it seemed like a good opportunity. And so purchased that and tried running it on the side. And it turns out he wasn't good at managing, and it was just a bit of a struggle. And a woman really wanted to buy it, and so I sold to her, and so that worked out well. So when I was a business broker originally, I dealt with a lot of the smaller businesses, but you kind of get your teeth wet. What is it? Teeth sharpened on them? I'm not sure what the term is. You kind of get started on the smaller businesses. But now I only usually do businesses that we can get close to $1 million price tag for. So most of the ones that we represent are between 2 and 50 million in revenue. We look for a net of about 300 grand. So sometimes they have lower in revenue, and sometimes the price once we dig in is a little lower than $1 million, but most of them are above that, and they tend to be a little bit more sophisticated. Once they get certainly above $1 million, but often above $500,000 in net. And when I say net, I'm talking adjusted EBITDA, which means you adjust for personal expenses. And if you get adjusted EBITDA above those numbers, then you start to get the financial buyers start to come into play. They're more interested in that. Above a price tag of 5, definitely above 10 million, sometimes above 5 in these days, the investment bankers start to get involved, and they have a different model than a typical broker. We just charge a commission and then an upfront marketing fee. Some brokers don't charge an upfront marketing fee, but we do a little bit more sophisticated version of presenting it. We're doing a video version that's it's pretty cool, actually. And we don't make money on that part of it. We just want to make sure they have a little skin in the game, and that they're serious about it, and that they're sophisticated enough to know that this makes a difference. And it actually saves a ton of time and effort on a seller's part, because what happens if you don't do a video of them, then the buyer has to talk to them. And no matter what I tell them, they want to hear from the buyer. And so a lot of times it means a lot of meetings for the seller with buyers. We try and pre-screen them, but still, if it's a popular business, it can be a lot of buyers. I'll talk to, like, I have an IT client, and I have NDAs, over 150 NDAs signed on it. And we talk to most of those buyers. So it's a lot.
So for close to 6 years, you were a business broker through First Choice Business Brokers. So you were kind of working under the umbrella of someone else, right? Mm-hmm. In those types of situations, let's say I came to you and I'm going to sell my business. How does that structure work? Is there typically an upfront fee, or is it simply when we sell the business, there's a commission, and typically what does that commission look like?
So under First Choice Business Brokers, and there's a distinction between First Choice and Excit Consulting Group, and I'll explain that. But First Choice, what they'll do is they'll charge a commission, often 12%. It'll go down a little bit as it gets bigger. And the fees are, or they'll do a minimum. So if you don't, and I think the minimum is still 15. I heard recently that maybe it was 20 now. So if your price tags say under 100 grand, you're still gonna have to pay 15,000. And they won't charge anything for marketing the business, but they do a very scaled down version of what's called a confidential information memorandum. And they won't do as much research on the business. For Excit Consulting Group, what we do is we charge a 20 grand marketing fee, and then a commission of 10% for most businesses. If they're larger, we'll go, we just sold one for 23 million, and the percentage was much lower. So it just depends a little on what. But the biggest distinction between First Choice and Excit Consulting Group is Excit Consulting Group also has consulting. And so if a business owner, we really want to represent what the business owner needs. And so, for example, sometimes they come to us and we'll do an after-tax, we'll do what we call a broker's opinion of value, what we think we can get on the market. And then part of that is an after-tax calculation so that they're not surprised by what they're actually going to walk away with. Because often when it comes down to selling it, they think they get this big price. And then when they see the amount of cash that they get in the end, they're totally frustrated and it can kill the deal at the end. But also, most importantly, we want to make sure they get what they need, because a lot of people, maybe they're depending on this for their retirement or at least part of their retirement. And if it's a lot lower, it can make a big difference in their lifestyle. So that's an aspect. And if for some reason we don't think they're going to get enough, we can help them grow the business so that they can get what they need. We've worked with some where we've brought in sales consultants, or we have a lot of financial expertise so we can figure out process and procedures. So that's helpful. Also, business owners come to us. When I was at First Choice, I was frustrated because the only option was to sell, and sometimes to an external party. And sometimes that's not the best solution. Sometimes people want to transition to a family member or an employee or a partner. And I wanted to have those options. And so at Excit Consulting Group, we do that as well. We'll even do ESOPs. And we do assessments sometimes, because sometimes people don't know what's the best option or haven't really thought through it. They might have some management that they want to, that they think could take over. And I'll tell you a story about that in a second. But so for our assessments, we'll go through and evaluate all the different options, look at their business, we look at three things. We look at owner readiness, business readiness, and market readiness. And owner readiness is really what do they need personally, and are they emotionally and financially ready to sell? Business readiness is really taking a deep look at their business scenario and where they have weaknesses or strengths. And market readiness is the timing in the market, because trying to sell real estate in 2007, it doesn't matter what it is, right? So sometimes the market, it depends on what's good in the market. And some of that depends on financial markets, like is there capital available to purchase? We're running into that a little bit now. The banks are a little tighter right now because of COVID. So hopefully we can get deals financed, but we're somewhat challenged with that. So anyhow, that's the assessment. And then the third thing that they might come to us with is they might have someone that is a strategic player or an identified buyer, and they just want help with that transaction. So, or they're selling to a partner. So we'll kind of do those three things to help them get through the process. But ultimately, it's really about what do they need and making sure they're going to get what they need through the process.
We hear these stories of men all the time who have built and scaled and sold businesses, but we don't hear that as often of women.
First of all, a lot of people who get ready to sell have already worked in the business for a long time, so they're older. And so the baby boomers, it was a different generation with women. They didn't tend to own. Now, sometimes women do own because their husbands passed, or, for some reason, family reason, they did pass it to that generation, but it's just much more rare. And I also say that entrepreneurs tend to be egotistical, and I don't always mean that in a negative way. Sometimes they have to believe in themselves enough to just get through the storms, and it's not an easy road. And so in some ways, I think that tends to be a little more male-dominated personality trait. I'm not... These are generalizations. I'm not my experience. I have had, if there are so few women broker that if there are women entrepreneurs out there, a lot of them I come across for selling, and there just aren't that many. Women don't always think as big, and so they're much less, and they're much more conservative when it comes to financing. I know I'm personally this way. I don't like to take on debt, and debt can grow a business. And there's pros and cons to it, but risk takers can grow and fail, or they can grow and succeed, right? And so there's kind of two sides to the coin. So I would say, that kind of adds some color to it. I certainly try to encourage women entrepreneurs to think big. But when I taught entrepreneurship at UCSD, this was interesting. I noticed in every class, and I taught for 8 years, that the men were more vocal and much more likely to raise their hand and make answers. And the women were much more likely to get the answers better on their homework. because there's often entrepreneurship is not a right answer, but there are better answers. And so it was very interesting. They know the material, they know it, but they're just less bold about it somehow. Yeah. But when I was in grad school, and had my MBA, I also noticed this dynamic. We'd be in groups, and so my group had 2 women and 5 men, and the other woman, and probably me too, would have answers as good as the men, but the men wouldn't even hear them. Until a guy said it, they didn't hear the answer. And I think it's that just that competitive dynamic where men are so used to competing against each other, but that's who they hear and see. I don't know. It mystifies me somewhat to this day. But.
Lamar, if somebody is at the point where they're thinking about selling their business, and hopefully they've been thinking about it and prepping for it for several years, from what I hear you say, it's not like you just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to sell my business in, a month, right? Because it's a process. You talked about some of the things that folks need to be really looking at, obviously financials and profitability, and can I even leave my business for a month and have it run without me, of course, is the big one as well. What are some of the other pitfalls you see, maybe even illustrate with some examples of folks that you've worked with?
Because I've seen so many situations where people have left hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on the table because they didn't prepare, or they didn't understand a term, or they didn't, just didn't do things right. And I'll give you an example on even understanding a term. This one business came to us, and they had someone that was courting them, and we said, we'll get them to put a number on the table. And so they talked to them again, and they got them to put a number on the table. And I think it was 7 or 8 million, which seemed like a good price to the seller. But when you take a closer look at the terms, it turned out they were leaving 5 million in the business in net working capital. And so net, they were getting 2. And if you don't understand those terms and how they work, it can really make a difference in what you actually walk away with. And so that's one example. But so I think there are different phases of preparing. And one is, first of all, on an individual basis, understand what the value of your business is, understand where you want that value to be and what that means in terms of if you want to invest that money and have a revenue stream from investments afterwards, what does that mean? So make sure I always say, do the math and make sure you include the after-tax part of it. And, certainly someone like me can walk you through that or help with that, because that's part of what we do. And then also a lot of owners don't realize the ego part of selling. And it's a very difficult thing, because sometimes, the buyer is going to try and tell you your baby's really ugly, because that means it's a lower value, and it can be very uncomfortable, which is one reason why I think it's good to have a broker or someone in between. If you're a sophisticated seller and maybe you have an attorney that can help you, but someone that can help negotiate that, because can buffer some of that, and working together afterwards is really important. So if you don't like them afterwards, that can be a challenge. But also, make sure you're emotionally prepared of what are you going to do after. I had a deal fall through because the seller just didn't know what he was going to do with himself if he sold, and he didn't want to hang out with his wife at home all day. He was afraid he'd drive her. He loved her. He was afraid he'd drive her crazy, and so. And in his mind, the terms were never right, but it really wasn't the terms. It was really that he just couldn't part with it. So that's the first step, is, you want to make sure you're prepared. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but one thing that sellers should always look at is what percentage of your portfolio of value is wrapped up in your business, because it can be a huge part of your net worth. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're running it, it seems low risk to you, but things like COVID can happen, and it can change your world dramatically. And so sometimes being a little bit more dispersed is better, so you don't have all your eggs in one basket. but so prepare yourself, make sure your business is prepared is another aspect of it. And things like recurring revenue are very popular for buyers. Making sure the business can operate without you, having that next layer of management, having processes and procedures in place, good accounting, all of those are really important aspects of selling your business. And one thing that's kind of interesting is I had a seller who was debating about selling or turning the business over to his kids, and the business was way underinvested in technology. And so if he invested what he needed in technology, it took a lot of the profits away. And whether you sold to an external buyer, you're turning the problem over to them, so they're going to pay a lower price. You decide to sell to your child, and maybe they'll pay a little bit more, but guess who has to pay for that investment in the future? They're going to have to do it to make the business successful. So it's not always a plan to avoid those things. So some of that, but then you also have to make sure that those investments make sense. I had one seller invest couple $100,000 in technology, and his business was worth $100,000. And just, make sure you're prepared, make sure your business is prepared, then understand the deal. And the deal is, sort of understanding the different buyers, understanding terms and the risks related to terms, what they are, what you can negotiate, those things, making sure you have advisors lined up, a good attorney, a good accountant, that all are familiar with deals. And then sometimes there's other advisors that make sense depending on the business. And then understand the closing phase, which due diligence is a big part of that. People are like, why does it take so long? But sometimes it's due diligence, sometimes it's negotiating the purchase agreement, and a lot of times it's the seller that actually slows it down. But it takes 6 to 9 months to sell most businesses at least, and that's if they're reasonably priced. If they're not reasonably priced, it takes a lot longer. Those phases and due diligence, what we do is we kind of do a preliminary due diligence so that we don't run into surprises when we go through due diligence, because that can derail a deal. I tell sellers it's a little like someone going through your underwear drawer and asking why you bought every pair, because they'll go back 5 years. A buyer will go back 5 years and question a transaction you made, and it seemed like it made sense at the time. So you just really have to understand that you got to kind of remove your personal emotions on some of that. And then the buyer is just really nervous that they're going to miss something and make a mistake. And so trust is the biggest part of it. They say in real estate homes, you don't want, you want that trust. You don't want to surprise a buyer because it can derail a deal. It's 10 times worse in business transactions because there's so many things that, they can't look at just every aspect of a business. So due diligence preparation is very important. And the faster that goes, anything with a deal, the faster it goes, the more likely it is to close. We always say time kills deals. And it doesn't make any sense. You're like, why, if someone really wants the business, why would extra time kill it? But there's a real wear out factor. And I warn sellers about this up front, that if you get too nitpicky and nit gritty up front, and kind of get buyers to that edge where they're annoyed, then later on, when you really need to sit down and negotiate those things that are important, their patience is already worn out, and you can either end up with worse terms or they'll walk away. So that's another aspect of it that it's good to be mindful of. Yeah.
How do I value my business?
Yeah, I do talk about valuations a lot.
Yeah.
So the simple answer is it's not that simple. There are a lot of multiples in industries that people throw around, and they're often, the multiples might be accurate, but what you multiply it by might not be, and so you have to be careful of that. For a small business, multiples they can start as low as 1.5 for like a small hair salon, but generally 2 is not a bad, and that's what's called seller's discretionary earnings. Seller's discretionary earnings is slightly different than adjusted EBITDA. The only difference is really the seller's salary. And the argument from a bank is that for small businesses, some sellers pay themselves a lot and some pay themselves a little. And so they add back whatever they pay themselves because they just want to take it out of the equation and have a level playing field. When a business gets to be a little bit larger, they include it because they assume that the seller gets paid a more market rate. And so adjusted EBITDA has the seller's salary in it. Seller's discretionary earnings doesn't, and that gets into a whole calculation, which I won't walk through the whole thing here, but trust me, I can help with it.
Yeah.
And then add backs are the term you'll hear a lot of, and that's what can make a lot of difference. So I'll give you an example. A seller wanted to sell his business, and I think he was making maybe 500 grand. And so for 500 grand, you might get a 3 times multiple, but that's the other thing that's beautiful about increasing the size of your business is the bigger the business, the bigger the multiple. And it makes sense because the bigger the business, the lower the risk. You have more people, more management, more customers, more buffer, so to speak, if things go right or go wrong. So, so you can get multiples, gosh, way higher if it's something on the public market, but even, in our world, we might see 5 or 6 if it's a really strong business and maybe has 3 million to 5 million in adjusted EBITDA. But first of all, every industry can be a little bit different. It'll depend on characteristics, and then other things like add backs can make a difference. And I'm going to give you an example of where an add back made a difference. This seller was sure his business was worth 2 or 3 times his 500 grand, but he neglected to notice that he was not paying himself rent. He owned the property and building. So once he calculated in rent, which was over 100 grand a year, his adjusted figure went down quite a bit.
So the multiple, it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, Lamar, is mostly on that number earnings before interest and taxes. That's the number we're looking at to then apply that 2 or 3 or 5 multiple to.
Generally, yes, but it depends again on the type of business, because if it's like accounting or legal, it's a multiple on revenue, and recurring revenue might get a higher multiple. I did an alarm business, and they had a multiple of what's called recurring monthly revenue, and it was like 35 times that. So it just depends on, sometimes there's industry characteristics that we have to pay attention to.
Well, Lamar, thank you for your time. It's really fun to share your story, not only being a business owner and having sold 3 businesses, but then also being on the other side of the table and being a broker and helping, I'm sure, hundreds of people go through this process, and your perspective on that is really, really helpful.
Happy to help.